This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. That's all you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast is, well, the title gives that one away. I'm here to talk of the stories of film. So I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, behind the scenes stories, marketing stories, all the bits and bobs really that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to choose for this podcast have a mainstream leaning to them, really. They tend to be films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I don't really want to do punchy down. I don't do snark. Instead, what the podcast is, if anything, is a celebration of just how difficult it is to get a film made. And the celebration bit kicks in by saluting the people who've managed to do so. Rarely for me, this episode does have a mini theme to it, in that it's a pair of films both executive produced by Steven Spielberg, and a pair of films that, well, I think it's fair to say one I like an awful lot more than the other. I'm going to start with the one that I really love. I'm going to take you back to 1989. I'm going to play you a little clip from the trailer. I'll get to the story of it the other side of this.
Do you remember the future?
With me. Where? Back to the future.
Are we back?
We're back.
You might just have guessed then that was a clip from the trailer for 1989's Back to the Future Part 2, directed by Robert Zemeckis, story by Zemeckis and Bob Gale, with Bob Gale credited with the screenplay. Cast for this one sees Michael J. Fox in 3 roles, Christopher Lloyd in 1, Leah Thompson in 1, Thomas F. Wilson in 2, Elizabeth Shue in 1. You also have in the cast for this one the likes of James Tolkien, Jeffrey Wiseman coming to him, Billy Zane in there as well. You get a very young Elijah Wood in the cast, and also Jason Scott Lee is in the ensemble too. Now, it was a little secret that 1985's Back to the Future, I don't think I'm going massively spoilery here, ended on something of a cliffhanger, as Doc Brown, played by Christopher Lloyd, and Marty McFly, played by Michael J. Fox, along with Jennifer, originally played by Claudia Wells, now played by Elizabeth Shue. Well, we see them going off into the future because something has to be done about Marty and Jennifer's kids. It's also pretty well known that that ending wasn't designed to lead into a sequel, that it was a bit tongue-in-cheek on the part of the writers of the first film, Bob Gale and Robert Zemeckis. But at the point where discussions began about a follow-up, well, that was going to be the problematic kicking off point. So there was no plan originally for a sequel, that Zemeckis and Bob Gale were coming up with other projects that they were off to do, but the conversation pretty much transformed once Back to the Future had been released, the original film. It became a huge smash pretty much instantly as well, and Universal, in an era where sequels weren't as commonplace as they are now, well, Universal was asking the question about a follow-up. As that question was being posed, Zemeckis was heading off to do another film with Steven Spielberg, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, that was going to be filmed in the UK, and it'd be fair to say that Zemeckis, for one, wasn't instantly biting Universal's hands off over the prospect of doing another film. Not necessarily because it had been, Back to the Future had been a difficult film to make, it had, but also he's just like hugely proud of it. And so there was a clause in Zemeckis and Gale's contract that basically prohibited a sequel or remake to be made without them being consulted about it first and being offered the chance to do it. It was clear that Universal, headed up then by Sid Sheinberg, wanted another movie. Now, this story is told, it's been told in a few places, but I've lent on Cassim Gaines's book, We Don't Need Roads, a little bit here, because it's quoted in that book as saying that Sid Sheinberg really pushed for this film, and in Bob Zemeckis' mind, Universal's stance was very clear. You could either be part of this or not, but we're making a sequel anyway. Now, Zemeckis throughout his career hasn't done sequels as a rule, that he'd had a success with Romancing the Stone, but he opted not to make The Jewel of the Nile. He did toy with a Roger Rabbit sequel for quite a while, but that didn't get off the ground in the end. And so he kind of came to the conclusion that this film's going to make, it's going to happen, it's going to be a successful movie by hook or by crook anyway, and do they really want to see someone else go and take this world and these characters that they've made and do something different with them? And so Zemeckis and Bob Gale started talking about if there was another film there and if there was another story that they wanted to tell. To give an idea of the timescale Universal was working to, when the first Back to the Future film arrived on video, remember that, in May of 1986, at the end of the film a card appeared that said to be continued. Now, it was still going to be several years before it could be continued, for reasons I'm going to come to, but it was clear at that point that this project was motoring. Now, Zemeckis and Gale then started talking to the core cast from the original film, because by the nature of the way the first film had ended, well, for starters, they needed to be absolutely sure that Michael J. Fox and Christopher Lloyd and ideally Claudia Wells would be returning. So they scouted the original cast, and Fox was interested, Lloyd was interested, Thomas F. Wilson was interested, Leah Thompson was interested. I'll come to Claudia Wells shortly. I'll come to Crispin Glover shortly as well, because that would also be a problem. But it was clear that there was enough interest from the core cast that they could press ahead and carry on. As such, it was left to Bob Gale in the first instance, and at this point he was developing a film of Doctor Strange as well, but it was left to Bob Gale at this point to start writing a script, and he talks about this on the extras on the Back to the Future 2 disc releases, because at this point for Robert Zemeckis, his time was being dominated by Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and so whilst they'd had conversations, it was Gale who went away to come up with effectively what draft zero of this movie was going to be. And so he fashioned a story that picked things up as it had to do with Marty, the Doc and Jennifer going forward in time, but ultimately his version of Back to the Future 2 would have taken everyone back to 1967 in that particular narrative. But it was when chatting to Zemeckis, because there was a problem with going into the mid-60s, in that would it really work for the ages of the characters of George McFly and Lorraine at that point in their story. But Zemeckis had something of a eureka moment here, because he figured they had a rare and never before done opportunity to go back into the original film in a sequel and basically to change and work with the original movie. That, therefore, became the thrust of where Back to the Future 2 was going to go, but there were still stumbling blocks before the script could be fully written. Because we come back to a dispute that was bubbling up with Crispin Glover, who played George McFly in the first film. Now, this dispute has been well reported and could fill a podcast on its own, so forgive me for brevity. What I always try and do with these podcasts is give you basically the building blocks to go and find out even more about the films concerned, and I'd encourage you, if you want to read more about this, there is an awful lot out there. But the bottom line was that Crispin Glover hadn't been happy with the ending of the original Back to the Future film. There've been various reports about how easy or otherwise he was to work with on that movie, but crucially, when it came to the second one, he wanted an upgraded contract. He wanted better remuneration, as most of the cast did. There was a disagreement over that between the producers and Glover over his salary. The bottom line, for the purposes of this, although I will come back to this story a little bit later, was a deal couldn't be struck, and as a consequence, the character of George McFly could not play much of a part in Back to the Future 2, which is why in Back to the Future 2, and this is a slight spoiler, not a massive one I don't think, we learn that George McFly has died in the year 20. When Marty gets to the year 2015, his father's passed away some time before. That's why it was simply because they couldn't reach a contractual agreement. Now, in the case of the character of Jennifer, Claudia Wells was stepping back from acting due to a serious family illness. They knew that the character of Jennifer was in the DeLorean. So, and Zemeckis has said in hindsight that if they knew they were going to do a sequel, they'd have just put both the Doc and Marty in the DeLorean at the end of the first film. But Jennifer, the character of Jennifer, was in there as well, and a friendly recasting of that role took place that Wells had to pull back herself. It was her choice, although forced by circumstance. She and Elizabeth Shue got on. Elizabeth Shue stepped in, and that's why one of the reasons why the opening of the end of Back to the Future was refilmed basically for the opening of Back to the Future Part 2. So Gale then kept working on the screenplay, and Zemeckis talked about this in Robert Emery's book The Director's Take 2 on the importance of finding that eureka moment that proved the catalyst for the film. And he says if he hadn't have been able to find an angle like that of going back into the first movie, he wouldn't have done the film at all. He said that what people want from sequels really, and what the audience expectation was the same movie but different, and he saw that as a huge challenge, not least that it had to be, so as someone who wasn't a fan of a sequel himself, Zemeckis wanted a sequel that he would want to see. So Gale did the first draft, and Zemeckis was made Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and Gale kept writing and writing and writing, and it all came under the working title Paradox. And the first script came in, and Gale and Zemeckis had been in contact throughout it, but the first script came in at a reported, depending which account you believe, 165 to 180 pages in all for the first draft, and they knew that was too big for the movie, but they'd thrown everything into the pot here. The film went from the future to 1955 to 1885 back to 1985, and then Zemeckis and Gale refined that script, and the draft reportedly went up to around 220 pages. So if we go with the old adage that 1 minute of one script page equals 1 minute of screen time, Back to the Future 2 was now looking like it was going to clock in close to 4 hours and cost a small fortune to realise. It was, in that state, a non-starter, and Universal's Sid Sheinberg would not have greenlit it in that state, or at least that's where the theory went, because as you more than likely know, this turned into not one film, but 2 films. Now, where that suggestion came from, there's a couple of accounts on that. Did it come from Steven Spielberg? That's possible. Or there's certainly a case that Bob Gale reportedly asked the production manager of the Back to the Future films, Joan Bradshaw, to cost up the price of the film as it stood, or the cost of 2 films. And she came back with 2 numbers, that to make one Back to the Future sequel would cost $50 million, to make 2 Back to the Future sequels would cost $70 million. That, just to put that into some degree of context, the first Back to the Future film had cost $20 million, and this was absolutely not the era of Hollywood mega budgets. In 1990, Die Hard 2 would be made for $75 million, and I remember the press articles just questioning whether it was possible that a film that cost that much money could ever make its cash back. $70 million was an enormous investment, but then this was a very unusual project that all of a sudden was being proposed. You have to go back to Alexander and Ilyas Salkind making 2 Three Musketeers films back to back, I think in the 70s, for the last time this had been successfully done. I mean, notably the Salkinds tried to do it again on a blockbuster scale with Superman 1 and Superman 2. That didn't quite go to plan, but that's a story for a future podcast. It's really important to get across, I think, that whilst it's commonplace now that we see these huge franchises that almost seem like they're filming continually, what was being proposed was radical. All the while, while these conversations were going on, the cast and crew were awaiting the start date for Back to the Future 2, that Robert Zemeckis had got to the point where he completed his work on Who Framed Roger Rabbit. This was now going to be his next project, and it was reportedly up to Steven Spielberg to go and see Universal boss Sid Sheinberg, to put the proposal to him that instead of one film, he was going to get two. He would never be able to get a second Back to the Future sequel as cheaply as he would now, assuming he was willing to press the green light. So Steinberg, obviously very keen to keep Spielberg happy as well, he agreed to the plan, to the insane plan. Now, the decision was formally made at the start of 1989. So this was the year that Back to the Future 2 was being released, to split the two films. But it still needed sign-off from the key personnel of the movie. So, for instance, Zemeckis recruited his regular director of photography, Dean Cundey, and the cast and crew were asked what they thought of it. And this was it. They were going to do it. It was going to involve a very long period of continual shooting, 11 months in all, but also for many on the crew, that was 11 months of guaranteed employment as well, in an industry that even then was pretty freelance driven. So it was the Los Angeles Times revealed in an article in February 1989, quote, Universal Pictures' unusual plan to produce the two films back to back is intended to keep production costs down and to take advantage of an extended break in Michael J. Fox's schedule. So this was crucial. It's pretty well known that on the first Back to the Future film, Michael J. Fox was shot the sitcom Family Ties during the day, and then he got a little bit of sleep at some point, but he was shooting Back to the Future during the night. Because Family Ties was coming to an end, he was going to have to do this again. That production on the Back to the Future films was going to begin in February 1989, and there would be a period of that while Fox was also going to be shooting the TV show. With the various bits of casting almost in place, the last thing to resolve was what to do about George McFly, because the script that had been written required George McFly to appear in 2015 as Marty, the Doc and Jennifer go to the future. And so they decided controversially to go with almost a body double idea. And an actor by the name of Jeffrey Wiseman was drafted in. He'd been working at Universal Studios, the theme park, and he was one of a bunch of people who was tested for the role. He went in, I mean, he talks about this in the aforementioned book by Cassine Gaines, where there's quite an extensive interview with him. And he talks about going in for effectively an audition with people who were of similar build to him. And he landed the role. And he knew it was Back to the Future. He was excited about it. He'd be paid $20,000 for taking the role on, but also when it actually came to the shoot, it would be problematic because he would have to wear extensive facial prosthetics for recreating certain sequences in the original movie, and also the future George McFly would be pretty much in the background or hung upside down for large periods of his screen time as well, all to disguise the fact that a new actor had stepped in. The challenging prosthetics would affect other performers as well. I mean, ironically, a film that was shooting nearby was Warren Beatty's Dick Tracy. I've covered that in a previous podcast, which also had actors weighed down by heavy makeup. But it sounds like the Back to the Future team got it worse. So, for instance, Thomas F. Wilson, who was playing the assorted iterations of Biff Tannen, at one stage was having up to 6 hours of in the makeup chair just to get ready for a day's shoot. Leah Thompson, for her 1985 in what was called the Biff Horrific version of 1985. She too would be under a lot of prosthetics, and she would describe how it was extremely uncomfortable, and both Wilson and Thompson, it left blisters on them, and it just wasn't a pleasant thing really to go through. Zemeckis would admit that of the three sections of Back to the Future Part 2, it's the future stuff that interested him the least. That he knew really, if you're going to do any kind of predicting the future, you're sort of on a hiding to nothing anyway. The amount of clickbait that arrived in 2015 comparing reality to what had been predicted in Back to the Future Part 2 sort of vindicated his decision a little bit. And he also said he found shooting the future part of it his least favourite part of making the whole trilogy as well. They got about, he talks about this on the disc extras, about how they got around half of their predictions right, but also what he wanted to do with their view of the future was he was used to dystopias on the big screen and dark miserable futures, and he wanted theirs to be bright and hopeful and just underpinned with humour as well. And they pulled in resources from, I mean, they reused vehicles from other sci-fi films, they threw everything at the enormous range of costumes that you see in there, but the whole idea was it had to be fun, it had to be in keeping with the lighter tone of the Back to the Future movies. Now, there's an awful lot of effects work in Back to the Future Part 2, but this is practically driven. That Zemeckis had just come off Who Framed Roger Rabbit. I mentioned that a couple of times. But it's important in that at this stage, even then, he was a groundbreaker in terms of the marrying up of effects work and live action, and he would go on to be even more of a groundbreaker. But he talked in the official making of Back to the Future Part 2 book that he was adamant he didn't want people to think about how the various tricks were done until they were on their way out of the cinema. And there was some really hugely impressive stuff, and I don't just mean flying cars and hoverboards, which were achieved through old-fashioned techniques quite a lot, through strings and things like that, and an awful lot of stunt work. But it was also the sequence that takes place in 2015 where the future McFly family is sat around a table interacting. And there are a couple of instances in the film where actors are interacting with other versions of their characters. And this was really, really difficult to do because it sounds like a really small thing. But the dinner table sequence has basically the same actor passing an object to the same actor in a different character. And we sort of take this for granted now that it can all be done with computers and such like. Back then, this hadn't really been attempted quite like this before, and it was one of the earlier groundbreaking jobs for Industrial Light and Magic, ILM, the famed effects house, that what they did for that was that they used lots and lots of optical effects shooting. So, for instance, the same actor would have to give the same performance in the same character 3 times before they moved on to the next character to give them all the splits that they needed to piece the section together. If you go to that kitchen sequence in Back to the Future Part 2 as well, the dining room sequence, it was absolutely imperative that nothing other than what was required to move moved, and so all the props around the side of that set were glued down because this was going to be shot over. It would take a couple of days to get all this nailed, and if one single item moved, they were in deep trouble. As it turned out, they were nearly in deep trouble because even though they glued everything down, one night they were shooting in Los Angeles, so occupational hazard, there was an earthquake that threatened to move things around. And Zemeckis talks about how he thinks that they moved very, very slightly, but they got the required extra bits that they needed in time, and it's very hard for people to tell just what had gone on there. There were also challenges in recreating the Enchantment Under the Sea dance sequence, a key sequence, of course, in the original Back to the Future film, in that not only were they having to mirror what had gone on in the first film, and a VHS tape of the original Back to the Future was a vital tool in the making of Back to the Future Part 2, but simple things like matching the costumes, finding those same costumes that were used like 3-4 years before was a problem. And in fact, in the case of Leah Thompson, she saved the day really, in that it turned out that when she needed the dress that she wore in the original film when she was playing Lorraine in 1955, they couldn't find it. It turned out she kept one of them at home and had to go back to home to pick up this dress that she realised that she'd taken home with her after the original shoot. Small things as well. I mean, the Hill Valley set where the Back to the Future films are set, of course, that it cost more to rebuild it for the second film and in various iterations, of course, than it cost to make it in the first place for the first movie. There were, in the end, 11 months of shooting, and it was a very pressurised shoot, this one, that when they made the first film, the expectation level was, it's non-existent. No one knew it was coming. This time, Universal was already starting to tease and promote that this new film was coming. The adverts were starting to hit the press. It was very well known that a sequel was on the way. It was less known that a second sequel was on the way in those pre-internet times. I'll come to that shortly. But even so, it was said that this was quite a fun film to shoot. It was just a bit more intense, and the pressure was just a bit more on. When the film went into post-production, though, well, this is where one of the ramifications of the ambitious idea of shooting two films back to back would come into play. That they finished shooting Back to the Future Part 2, depending which account you believe. They then downed tools for a week or two, or possibly 3 weeks, and then they started shooting Back to the Future Part 3, but they were shooting that in a different part of the world. They were moving to Northern California to shoot that, and as a consequence, Robert Zemeckis found himself having to edit one film whilst shooting the next one. And he would say in an interview in hindsight that he thinks the edit of Back to the Future Part 2 was rushed. Even that said, it's still a very lean film. But the part where there was a 3-4 week overlap where Zemeckis was shooting the train sequences of Back to the Future Part 3, whilst Bob Gale was left back in Los Angeles in Burbank, where he was overseeing the dubbing of Back to the Future Part 2 and just bits and bobs that he could do. And so what would happen was at the end of every day shooting on Back to the Future Part 3, Zemeckis would then jump on a plane for an hour or two, would be flown back to the Burbank area, they'd give him some food. Zemeckis would then oversee what had been done during that day. He'd be put up in a hotel right near the airport, and then the following morning he would be slap bang back on a plane, went back to the set of Back to the Future Part 3, and he would continue to shoot that movie. It was an incredibly intense period of his life. And Zemeckis has talked about this in interviews since, that he said he just basically didn't stop working for a long period of his life, and he paid family ramifications for that. Again, those interviews are out there. I'm not going to dig too deep into that. There were bits and bobs. I mean, they did bits and bobs that didn't make it to the film as part and parcel of that edit. So there are deleted scenes that you can find on the disc as well. And they did have time to do a test screening of this one. And one of the things that was noticed, there was originally a scene in the 1985 segment, the Biff Horrific segment of 1985. I think it's pretty well known that was the Biff Tannen we see in that segment was influenced by Donald Trump. And that was before Donald Trump really became Donald Trump. But there's a sequence there where Marty would have seen his brother, played by Mark McClure, but notably missing in the sequence that was shown to the test audience was an appearance by Marty's sister, played by Wendy Jo Sperber. She was one of those who couldn't return for the film because she was pregnant at that point, and as a result, test audiences were wondering where Marty's sister had gone, and ultimately it was decided that that sequence had to be pulled out of the film. But McClure was told in advance by Zemeckis that he wasn't going to ultimately be in the movie. The bubbling dispute was carrying on with Crispin Glover, and there was still there were threatenings of legal action at this point, which ultimately would come to fruition. I think it's pretty well known that in the aftermath of Back to the Future Part 2, that Crispin Glover would sue Universal Pictures over the reuse of his work and his image from the first movie, and ultimately that was a case that was settled out of court, but it would have ramifications for rules set by the Screen Actors Guild that would stop a company being able to reuse a performance from an original film without the consent of the actor or payment to the actor. And so that had the ramifications of that are still being felt in acting today. The way Universal was selling the movie was not to the taste of Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale, because what they weren't saying was there's a Back to the Future Part 3 to come. And Bob Gale gave an interview on this, and he said, I had a big fight with Tom Pollock at Universal, who was the studio chief, about the marketing of Part 2. And Gale said, I absolutely wanted the audience to know before they bought their ticket that this was Part 2 of 3. Pollock wanted the audience to think that Part 2 was complete in itself, even though he knew full well it wasn't. And he just gambled that the audience wouldn't mind that. And of course, Back to the Future Part 2 ends with an extensive trail for Back to the Future Part 3. That was something that Zemeckis and Gale both wanted to put into the film, and they won that particular fight. But when the film was ultimately released and put in front of audiences, there was backlash for that. And again, hindsight, it's easy to overlook that this was the case. People did not know that there was another film coming. The vast majority of the audience did not know at that point, and so they got there expecting a fully rounded resolved film. They didn't get it. They got a film that ended on a cliffhanger, and Bob Gale argues that they lost some real goodwill from the audience for that, and also it gave the critics some ammunition that they didn't need a second opportunity to fire. That the key criticism aimed at Back to the Future Part 2 was it was an extended trailer for Back to the Future Part 3. 3, and it was quite hard for the filmmakers to fully shake that accusation off. The film then got a critically mixed response in the end, but again, not for the first time, there was no arguing the box office. And I have to say, I loved this film. This film for me was my Avengers when I was growing up. This was the film I rewatched time and time and time again. And even though I would probably rank it as probably the weakest of the Back to the Future films, that's like asking me to like pick between my children a little bit. I really love this film. It opened to a then staggering $27.8 million opening weekend in the US on November the 22nd. Pretty much every other studio had given them a wide berth. There wasn't a big new release up against it that week. To give you an idea of what it was up against, the Eddie Murphy directed Harlem Nights had opened the week before. That was number 2 at the box office. Back to the Future 2 had done 2-3 times its business. The Little Mermaid was in 3. Look Who's Talking at 4. Still Magnolias at 5. But again, no new film had come out in that week. Batman was still in the top 15, 23 weeks after release, incidentally. The path then was set for Back to the Future Part 3, which I have covered in a previous episode. I might go back and do that again in a bit more detail at some point in the future. But the box office of Back to the Future Part 3 was down on the second film. That Part 2 ultimately in the end would gross 331 million worldwide. Part 3 a little bit below that. And there was the feeling that it was part of losing some of that audience trust. I think hopefully those wounds have been far healed over time. And rightly so. I think Back to the Future Part 2 is regarded as a hugely ambitious, hugely interesting sequel. And you know what? I, for one, absolutely love it. Which brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. Boy, am I waffling. I'm going to have to talk fast. The latest issue of Film Stories magazine with a world exclusive look behind the scenes of the new D'Artagnan and the Three Muskehounds movie. I was really chuffed to get that. That is going on sale just as this podcast is being released. You can order a copy of it there at store.filmstories.co.uk. But also, I am 100% an independent publisher. It is me in a room, and a not very tidy room. I have got this far because of word of mouth and the kindness of people like yourself. If you do like this podcast, please do leave ideally a hugely positive review for it at your podcast host of choice. Please also hit the subscribe button. Those things help small independent publishers an awful lot. I'm now, though, going to go straight into the second of the 2 films I'm going to talk about. Another one executive produced by Steven Spielberg. This one less successful. Let's go to 1994. I'm going to play you a clip from the trailer.
This summer, from Universal Pictures and Amblin Entertainment.
Flintstones, meet the Flintstones, and not a crazy family. From the town of Bedrock, they take right out of history. Let's ride with the family down the street.
John Goodman, Rick Moranis, Elizabeth Perkins, Rosie O'Donnell, Kyle MacLachlan, Halle Berry, Jonathan Winters, the BC-52s, and Elizabeth Taylor.
Fred Flintstone, you've arrived.
I'm only one man. Not from the back.
It doesn't get any better than this.
Steven Spielberg presents The Flintstones.
Lord, where do you start with this one? We're at 1994's The Flintstones. Full disclosure, it's not a film I hugely love, this one, but I find the story behind it endlessly fascinating. Let's do the basics first then. Directed by Brian Levant, writing credits, Lord, are we going to come to that as well? Tom S. Parker, Jim Genowine and Stephen E. D'Souza shared the credit in the end. The cast, great. John Goodman, Elizabeth Perkins, Rick Moranis, Rosie O'Donnell, Kyle MacLachlan, Halle Berry, Elizabeth Taylor in a very, very rare role at that point in her career, also rounding out this particular ensemble. So, the idea then of doing a live-action Flintstones movie based on the hugely popular Hanna-Barbera cartoon went back to the mid-1980s, and that's when producers Keith Barish and Joel Silver picked up the rights to the show and then commissioned a script. And the idea at that point was that Richard Donner, who was doing the Goonies around then, was just about to come to Lethal Weapon, would direct the movie. So, the first script for the Flintstones, and not the last, would be written in 1987 by the prolific Steven E. D'Souza. Now, at this point, James Belushi, well, he was earmarked to play Fred Flintstone. Rick Moranis already in the conversation to play his sidekick Barney Rubble. Now, Belushi would fairly quickly depart this one, but don't feel too sorry for him because he got given a Mercedes by Joel Silver, as the story goes, for his non-performance in that. I'd like to thank Empire's August 1994 issue for that little tidbit. Early names in the running for the role of Fred, well, they also included John Candy, Dan Aykroyd, Chevy Chase, Bill Murray, but it was going to be a long time before they had a script that would work. So in 1987, this was a pivotal fork in the road, really. Universal Pictures bought up Hanna-Barbera's merchandising rights, and that meant the end for Joel Silver and Keith Barish's involvement in this particular project. But what it meant was that Universal gave this project to Steven Spielberg's Amblin Entertainment Company, which had its deal set up on the Universal lot. So, the script that was written by Steven E. D'Souza, that didn't pass muster, and so by 1989, new writers were on board. So Daniel Goldin and Joshua Goldin, they produced the second draft, which was ready by the autumn of 1989. That didn't pass muster. Next up, and this I'm grateful to Variety for detailing all of these, Peter Martin Wortman and Robert Conte, they wrote a script. That arrived in the spring of 1990. That didn't pass muster. Mitch Markovitz, he was next. By the autumn of 1990, he'd written a script for the Flintstones. That didn't pass muster. Summer of 1991, in came a version written by Jeffrey Reno and Ron Osborne. That didn't pass muster. Spielberg was said to be one of the one who was rejecting lots of these scripts. Now, in the midst of that, Spielberg was off making, at the late 80s, he was off making Always, and it was at the table reading for Always, which co-starred John Goodman, that he told Goodman that he was working on a Flintstones film and that Goodman should be playing Fred Flintstone. He envisaged him in the lead role, and that was a constant in the conversation from that point onwards. Always would go on to be a much quieter film in Steven Spielberg's canon of directorial work, but it would forge the relationship between Goodman and Spielberg that ultimately would lead to his appearance in the Flintstones. By this stage, where are we now? In terms of the scripts, we're in the early 90s. So Richard Donner was no longer interested in directing. He hadn't been happy with the scripts. He'd been involved with the project for about 18 months before he departed. So at this point, when it came to a director, Spielberg instead turned to a Flintstones fanatic. Now, director Brian Levant had enjoyed a box office success with a not very good film, in my view, 1991's Problem Child 2. It wasn't even the original Problem Child, which infamously turned up in Martin Scorsese's Cape Fear, great moment in that film. But nonetheless, Problem Child 2 landed Levant his next job, which was 1992's Beethoven, a film that has spawned 3 million to date direct-to-DVD sequels. Beethoven was a hit, and Spielberg saw it and liked it and was impressed by the fact it was a hit. It was a hit for Universal as well. And so Levant had now crossed over from television into film, that he'd had a background working on shows like Mork and Mindy and Happy Days, and Spielberg hired Levant to make the movie. He was going to be the director of the Flintstones. He was also an absolute flat-out Flintstones fanatic. I think this was pretty well known. But when he came in, he went through all the scripts that had been written and he threw the lot out, and instead he adopted a rare television way of approaching the writing of the Flintstones film. By that, I mean he brought together a lot of writers and sat them all round a table, which was very much the exception, by distance the exception when it came to film. We've seen it relatively recently when studios are trying to get cinematic universes off the ground. I think we saw that with Transformers and with the G.I. Joe films, but nonetheless, this wasn't done in films. The catalyst for what happened next was a writer by the name of Michael Wilson, and in the summer of 1992, he came up with a 4-page treatment for a fresh story that would be at the heart of the Flintstones. And finally, this seemed to pass some degree of muster. It just needed someone to flesh it out into a screenplay. So Tom S. Parker and Jim Genowine, they were hired and came in and did a couple of drafts that were completed by the end of 1992. Still wasn't ready. In came Gary Ross, known for directing like Pleasantville, Seabiscuit, the first Hunger Games. He did a draft. still wasn't ready. Then Levant brought in 8 television writers. So they are, he says with a deep breath, Al Adekman, Cindy Beagle, Lloyd Garver, David Silverman from The Simpsons, Steven Susterosic, Nancy Steen, Neil Thompson. Levant was one of them as well. And they had 8 writers round the table working on the script. And then, as they continued to refine it, more writers came in. But all the writers came in. Rob Dames, Lenny Rips, Fred Fox Jr., David Saville, Lon Diamond, David Richardson, Roy Teacher, Richard Gurman, Michael J. Giacchino and Ruth Bennett. They were all brought along to have a go at the Flintstones script and to contribute to it. Then $100,000 was handed over to the writers of Parenthood and City Slickers, Lal Gans and Babylon Mundell. They did about 48 hours of work on the Flintstones for their $100,000. More changes done, and eventually a final script was completed, but it wouldn't actually be completed and registered until the film had nearly wrapped production. Now, this whole way of writing the film came under fire in the trade press, in the Hollywood trade press, and Levant would defend it in an interview with Film Review in its August 1995 issue. And he says, I'm quoting it here, "This isn't an unusual way to work on TV sitcoms. On TV projects, a group of writers sit together and try to top each other's jokes. I've been criticised for working this way on the Flintstones, but when it comes to comedy, the more heads you have writing jokes, the better you are off. Even the original Flintstone series was written by 8 guys." Finally, they were at a point to go ahead with the movie and start shooting it. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to wind back to January 1993, which was when casting for the film started to come together. So by this point, and this is from a Los Angeles Times report, Goodman was still on board. He'd been on board for three and a half years at this point. But also most of Goodman's filming time was taken up with the hit TV show Roseanne. And so it became clear that the shoot for the Flintstones was going to have to take place during the summer hiatus from filming Roseanne, which otherwise took up most of the year. Now, in line for the role of Barney Rubble, well, Danny DeVito was actually offered the role, but he turned it down. He didn't figure he was quite right for it. He recommended Rick Moranis, who was, might recall, first mooted right the way back when this project started in the mid-1980s. Now, the real casting coup for the film was Elizabeth Taylor, and this was her last live-action role. She'd been off-screen at this point for over half a decade, and it was Kathleen Kennedy, one of the executive producers and obviously a key part of Amblin Entertainment at this point, who'd become alerted to the fact that Taylor was looking for a small supported role she could do, one that was high-profile, the one that was fun, and it was felt that it would be quite a thing to land her for the Flintstones. And so she was identified as the top choice to play, this is what the character's called, Pearl Slaghoople. An offer thus went out to Elizabeth Taylor, and what helped ice this particular deal was that they told her if she signed up, the film's premiere would be a charity affair to benefit Taylor's AIDS Foundation, for which she'd put in an awful lot of work, and Elizabeth Taylor duly signed up to play the role of Pearl. When it came to Wilma Flintstone, well, Gina Davis was in the mix for that one, along with Catherine O'Hara, her name was mentioned, Faith Ford, her name was mentioned. It would ultimately be Elizabeth Perkins who signed up to take on the role. When it came to Betty Rubble, well, Janine Turner, who had been shooting Cliffhanger with Sylvester Stallone, but had sprung to life off the back of the TV show Northern Exposure, she was one of the last 2 choices. The other was Rosie O'Donnell, and what swung the role O'Donnell's way was she was able to get the giggle, the little chuckle of Betty Rubble. You heard it just at the end of that clip, I think, right at the start. And so she was duly picked to join the ensemble. The role of Miss Stone was cunningly offered to Sharon Stone. Then she shot to fame off the back of Basic Instinct, but Stone had a lot of offers. She had a lot of other commitments, and as such she turned down the role, and in came Halle Berry, who then was best known for the TV show Queen and also for appearing opposite Eddie Murphy in the underrated Boomerang. But this was quite an ensemble that they'd pulled together, with Goodman leading it as Fred Flintstone. This was full steam ahead. So the start date for shooting would be April 1993, and it was something of a crunch to get to that point. The film had a budget of around $45 million, but a good 10% of that was to be spent on recreating the land of the Flintstones. The set that was built in a quarry in California cost nearly $5 million to build. The rest of the shooting was done on the Universal backlot. It's worth noting that when it came to casting the children of the Rubbles and the Flintstones, so that would be Pebbles and Bam Bam, Premiere magazine around the time had an excellent article that just talked about the lengths that the parents went to get their infants cast in this movie. Because what they decided to do was, given that this was going to be a tight shoot anyway, they wanted twins to take on both roles, so it would just give them a bit more shooting time with the young kids. And this Premiere article talks about parents who were sending their kids, who were 1-2 years old, with chicken bones in their hair and things like that, just to try and give them a bit of kind of ancient authenticity. Those were the ones who didn't get the role, you'll be surprised to hear. The actual physical production and all the creatures in and around the world of the Flintstones, well, they were going to be designed by the Jim Henson Creature Shop, the brilliant Jim Henson Creature Shop. It was based primarily working out of Camden in London, and they had to build 24 creatures for the film, and they had 12 weeks to turn all this work around. A huge brontosaurus was one of the creatures that they had to put together. Meanwhile, Universal, fresh off the back of the previous summer's Jurassic Park, which had been a merchandising bonanza, well, it really felt that the Flintstones was going to do similar business, or at least have not dissimilar impact in the summer of 1994. This was its big film for that summer, and thus it set about signing up commercial partnerships and product placements and things like that. McDonald's did its first ever global movie tie-in for a film with the Flintstones. I didn't know that. And an extensive merchandising line was being designed, which meant that when the Flintstones landed in cinemas in the summer of 1994, and when you walked out loving the film, you would be able to walk into pretty much any shop and get some Flintstones tat, really, to remind yourself of the fun that you've had. On set of the film, with the shoot running in earnest in searing heat, it's worth noting. I mean, the main bulk of the shoot went from May to August of 1993, and Goodman would tell Empire magazine on the set that at this point he could sure use a hit movie. I mean, he'd done the King Ralph and The Babe and Born Yesterday, and not all of those had even made it into a UK cinema. The Flintstones would, of course, ultimately get him his big hit that he hadn't really had before. One of the most challenging sequences to get was the recreating the animated opening of the Flintstones TV show. Now, in that, there's a 5-second sequence where Fred Flintstone slides down at the back of his brontosaurus crane, shouting "Yabba Dabba Doo." That 5 seconds took 20 hours to capture for the film version of the Flintstones. It was one of the many key sequences that had to be shot outdoors. And as Rick Moranis told Film Review magazine, the temperature was averaging 100 degrees. And it was in the midst of that they were having to juggle the effects work, the animatronics, the huge puppets, as well as having a huge cast outside. And it was described as pretty unbearable heat in which to work. Still, the production wrapped up on time, certainly in time that John Goodman could go back and continue filming Roseanne as well. But before the movie could make it into cinemas, there was the small problem of trying to sort out the screenwriting credits on the movie. That it was estimated in the end that 35 writers had contributed in some form to the screenplay and the many very funny jokes of the Flintstones film, and it was basically left to the Writers Guild of America to sort it all out. Now, I remember going to a cinema around this time and seeing a stand for the Flintstones movie in the foyer that had the credits at the bottom, and at that point 8 writers, I remember counting it, 8 writers were listed down on the credits bar. By the time the film came out in cinemas, cinemas, there were no longer 8 writers. So what had happened is Universal had submitted all the credits as it's supposed to do, and it had recommended that the 8 screenwriters who were brought in by Brian Levant right at the start of when he took on the film would get the screenwriting credit. Well, the Writers Guild of America were never going to give 8 writers credit on a feature film. Instead, as they do, they tend to default to the person who wrote the first script. So that was Stephen E. D'Souza. So he gets a written by credit. And then it was decided that Tom S. Parker and Jim Genowine, who were fairly early in the process, comparable to everyone else, had done the most substantive work on the screenplay that we ultimately got. And the fight for credits is really important, just because residuals and bonuses are tied. It's not just having something on your IMDb page, though IMDb wasn't quite the thing then, but it's the fact that there is a financial knock-on to if you get the credit on a movie of this ilk. Nonetheless, the film was completed, the credits were in place. All it was going to take now was to release it into cinemas and hope for the start of a franchise. Well, the critics got in first. To call the reviews hostile would not be much of an understatement. The film would end up on lots of people's worst films of the year list. It was fairly savaged. That would be fair to say. That said, made barely a jot of difference to the box office. That the film opened in the US on May the 27th, 1994. It opened against Beverly Hills Cop 3. Now, Beverly Hills Cop 3 underperformed with a $12 million opening. The Flintstones opened to $29.6 million, on its way to $130 million in the US, to $211 million overseas, for a total gross of $340 million for this, $46 million film to make. It was not a failure, at least commercially, by any real measure. The one thing it wasn't Jurassic Park level. So I suppose there is one measure, it was slightly a failure. But Universal had hoped for something bigger, but it would return a profit for the movie. It would go on to do well on video as well. But it was the ferocity of the dislike of it that seemed to dissuade Universal from jumping straight into a sequel. We've sort of seen this before when Tim Burton did his take on Planet of the Apes in 2000. It was a big, solid box office hit. And the plan then was to do more Planet of the Apes films in that line with that cast. But the film was so regarded as so disliked that 20th Century Fox stepped away from that idea. In the case of the Flintstones, Universal didn't quite do that. Levant went on to do Jingle All the Way straight after it. But by the time it decided it wanted to have another go at a Flintstones film, it changed pretty much everything around. That it pressed the prequel button. That whilst there were 1 or 2 people who did reappear in slightly different ways, the whole cast was pretty much replaced for what became the Flintstones in Viva Rock Vegas, which was slightly better received. Levant directed this one again, and it's regarded, I think, as the best of the 2 movies. But the Flintstones sequel just did nowhere near the business of the first movie, and any chance of any continuation of this live action line of Flintstones films, well, let's just say those chances had come to an end. As it happens now, as we stand, I mean, there's often talk of the Flintstones coming back. If anything, the torch has now been passed on to the Jetsons, that there's talk of a new Jetsons film, which is basically the Flintstones in the future. So I would expect to see the Jetsons before you see the Flintstones again. But what the Flintstones has proven to be is kind of a bit of a lesson in committee-driven writing and committee-driven filmmaking, that so many writers could come together and with the best will in the world, I don't want this to sound mean, but struggle really to come up with that many funny jokes between them. Does that way of working work? The Flintstones would suggest, in films at least, probably doesn't. Which brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. If you want to hear more of my waffling, crikey, you've suffered enough, you'll find me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You'll find the entire Film Stories project on Twitter at Film Stories Pod. Our website is growing, www.filmstories.co.uk. Every weekday there's a new, at least 1, usually 2 new film features on there, as well as loads of news stories and reviews. You can find all of our magazines and back issues and subscriptions and Christmas gift subscriptions and all stuff like that at store.filmstories.co.uk. We reside on Facebook at facebook.com/filmstoriesonline, on YouTube with some video exclusive film stories at youtube.com/filmstories. I think that's probably just about it for a week, isn't it? As always, the most important thing remains you all stay safe and take care of yourselves. I thank you again for listening to Film Stories. Whether you're new or returning, you're always welcome. I'll be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Until then, you all take care. Thank you very much. Bye bye.